Okie dokie. Hello, everyone. More this and that. It's Monday. Um, Happy Memorial Day, I suppose. You're not really supposed to say that it's a happy day. It's an unhappy day, in fact. The former center for the Boston Celtics and the uh, dynastic UCLA Bruins, Bill Walton, passed away today from cancer. So it's a pall over the Pac-12, if nothing else. And for Grateful Dead fans, people should also mourn as well. So anyway, with that somber beginning for Memorial Day, we're going to try and introduce Rosa Luxemburg. And obviously, you can't do this in a single session. It's the entire websites, streets, books, etc. There was a 2004 Rosa Luxemburg reader that I think that we'll try and at least plow through the introduction, which is about 27 pages. So if anything, that's what will complete this sometime this week. And let me give you the sort of the blow by blow, and we're going to skip to something else. Perhaps on Wednesday we'll watch a very well, not so very long, but a movie on Rosa Luxemburg, a biopic. We'll see whether that's a worth it or not. Has German subtitles. um, it is in English, I think. And so we'll try and look at that as well. At the end today, we'll look at the short, brief thing on Rosa Luxemburg from one of the important sites for Rosa Luxemburg stuff. And to give you the quick and dirty version, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg is part of the most probably intense history, the history of not only communism, but social democracy, or the Social Democratic Party of Germany. The concern for the Spartacus sort of movement, which for many people, particularly in the United States, implies a kind of direct action, which I think is really important. So that's if there is any kind of thing that she represents, is not only the role of women, even though some people would trash her because she wasn't enough of a feminist, but she was also a revolutionary, and I think it's really important to note that, and that she was a martyr. She died for a revolution, and I think that's really important to remember as well. And if you want to get into who was at fault, you can also blame the Social Democrats who allowed the Freikorps to essentially torture and kill her. So her principal text is The Accumulation of Capital, and we're going to maybe look at that more closely. It is completely available online. I think there are texts available. I did upload the reader that I'll be talking about in a second. It's just important to think of her as an important economist, a woman economist. You need to see her in the same light as Joan Robinson, and to see both of their works, had there been less perhaps misogyny in the Nobel Prize, either one, more likely Joan Robinson, would have been the first woman Nobel Prize winner. So that's recipient. So that's another part of that element. Let me just read this brief little moment, and it is the end paragraphs from the introduction to the reader. It's a 2004 reader. Her visionary commitment to socialist democracy and human liberation, and her virulent opposition to bureaucracy, excessive entralism, and elitism offer a permanent challenge to those who would narrow the struggle against capitalism to piecemeal reforms, or unprincipled compromises with reactionary tendencies. There's a lot loaded in there. Much of this year's election has some of those elements in it. You could even say that was going on in the Libertarian Party's opposition to Trump 2 days ago. Her work speaks to the need for a deeper form of democracy, a socialist democracy grounded in a humanist outlook, free of both authoritarianism and the claim that any attempt to go beyond the narrow horizons of capitalist democracy will necessarily end in chaos or totalitarianism, currently what we're doing. Moreover, her critique of war and imperialism continues to resonate, as does her deep identification with those who suffer the most under the domination of global capitalism, from working class women to those subjected to the barbarism of colonial rule. Also, what we are looking at in terms of Israel-Gaza. Another 40 people were killed in a strike in a supposedly violence-free zone, a safe, so-called safe zone in Gaza. Given our own situation today, we cannot afford to have a bad break between the generations, at least when it comes to absorbing and rethinking the contribution of so historic a figure as Rosa Luxemburg. In this sense, the final words that we have from her pen ring as loudly today as when she wrote them. I was, I am, I shall be. That's from Hudis and Anderson's The Rosa Luxemburg Reader, a copy of which is uploaded into the files section in Discord, so you can get a full copy of it. And, this is from an abstract on a paper that compares Rosa Luxemburg and Joan Robinson. An interesting paper, fairly recent, actually. It's a working paper from Portland State, a very left economics department, actually. Not completely, though, but, it is Portland, Oregon, that is. Both Rosa Luxemburg and Joan Robinson advanced ideas on the accumulation of capital. Related to their social status in their respective eras, each proposed their distinct ideas on the expansion of production and the accumulation of capital. Both scholars bring into consideration the alarming ways that a seemingly ceaseless expansion in turn calls for an expansion of a marketplace for generating sufficient levels of demand for output. These two authors, Rosa Luxemburg and Joan Robinson, offer historical examples drawn from around the globe, ranging from the commodification of land on the Indian subcontinent to the opium wars in China and beyond. Now, this essentially extends the same ideas that Marx and Engels were working on in terms of colonialism in the latter part of their writing. It also signals the other issues that Lenin was interested in terms of extending the analysis of imperialism. And so all of those things are sort of still there and still quite vital. And in fact, you could say that some of our relations to the current crisis in People's Republic of China are symptomatic of the same issues of colonialism that go back to the Opium Wars. So anyway, I use that. For those of you who are too tired or weary from reading books, you might just read the review, which I think is actually fairly comprehensive, and the German scholar, so it's more trenchant in that sense. Jennifer Benner was the reviewer of the Peter Hudis, Kevin B. Anderson book, The Rosa Luxemburg Reader. It's a monthly review press book of 2004, and if you're, don't want to go through the whole thing, at least it talks about the introduction. It talks about her major work, accumulation of capital, talks about a variety of ways in which Hudis and Anderson try to make it very contemporary and try to link a lot of other secondary sources, which are all equally important and may be more important for us in a more contemporary context. Now, the background against which Rosa Luxemburg operates is this is a picture of Rosa, is against, as at the end of her life, the transition that was occurring was both the Russian Revolution, the revolution in Russia, from which emerges the Soviet Union, and the revolution in Germany, from which is ostensibly created the Weimar Republic, which with all of its issues, problems. The Weimar Republic is a fairly deep history because of the singular topic of the rise of Nazism. If it had been something or other, the counterfactuals are, and which are still applicable to this day. How is it that fascism arose in Germany? Why wasn't it combated better? Why did it happen? And so some of those same elements are in our current discourse: questions of authoritarianism, fascism, racism, everything that we see in the 2024 election sort of is at work in the ongoing problems of the brief Weimar Republic and the early Nazi rise of Nazism. I include a initial little thing from 1978's publication by Ernest Mandel, who's equally important. We've read Ernest Mandel before, and still a key person in terms of the history or the historiography of Marxist thought, particularly post-war Marxist thought in the international or European context. And then I'll read a little bit from here, and this probably gives a decent enough introduction. That is the Introduction to Political Economy, and this is the unfinished text. As I've said before, we're confronted with a lot of unfinished work. Marx's work can be referred to as incomplete in that particular context, but with all these manuscripts and Engels editing and stuff that never got published and stuff that gets discovered after World War II, et cetera. Similarly, Luxemburg's work, the last work of hers, the unfinished Introduction to Political Economy, it's actually interesting because it doesn't necessarily appeal sort of in a kind of slavish devotion to Marx. It actually talks about other political economists of her time, and not specifically within the context of Marxism. And in some ways, she was drawing a comparison to the more strict Bolshevik kind of approach to communism that was also going on. So there's some interesting strains in here. And for many people who have a kind of discomfort to the kind of orthodoxy of some kind of actually existing communism or actually existing socialism, Stalinism, and all that stuff. This is, it's important to always look at the German context for this, because after all, it was the site where Marx operated. It is the place, next to Switzerland, et cetera, where people like Lenin were hiding out, running around. And so you can see that there's a fairly complex situation with all of the usual provisos. That is, of course, you could have those kind of people, but you also have the Nazis running around. And because the Nazis are running around at, from a fairly early period, actually, from the turn of the century. The Introduction to Political Economy was the product of Rosa Luxemburg's activity as a professor in the Central School of the German Social Democratic Party in Berlin. This school was opened on 15 November 1906 and received some 50 students per semester. This is not unlike what the People's Forum, for example, is trying to do. From 1 October 1907 on, it counted Luxemburg among its teachers. She replaced Rudolf Hilferding, and Hannes Pannekoek, who had been banned from teaching politics by the Prussian police. Now imagine, this banning by the police of doing certain things, not unlike gun control, rather it's political control. And needless to say, these kinds of ideas, imperial ideas, could come back. You certainly see that in attempts to censor ideas in universities, or at least political speech, so-called free speech. They taught political economy and economic history. So those are the two field areas, and really the key important areas for any economics department. It's not simply about the theory of the economy, but rather, or the applied economy, but rather the combination of history and political practice. From 1911 on, she also gave a course in the history of socialism, replacing Franz Mehring. So those all some kind of heavy hitters, Hilferding, Vonnegut, Mehring. The idea of having these lectures published came to her, it seems, in 1908. But in the meantime, the subject would allow Luxemburg to make her personal contribution to the history of Marxist economic theory, the problem of imperialism, or as Luxemburg titled it, the accumulation of capital, increasingly absorbed her materially and intellectually. The accumulation of capital was published in 1913. That's the version that's available online. And it was probably only after completing her magnum opus that Luxemburg resumed writing her introduction to political economy. In other words, she did a master work, but the kind of course text that you could use in your lectures is kind of this, I make the same presumption with a introduction to land economics, which Monroe does pretty much the same kind of job I would have done with it. Interrupted once again, now by the outbreak of war, she continued to work on the introduction during her stay in prison. Needless to say, political prisoners did exist in great numbers. In Wronke, in the German province of Posen, in 1916 to 17. Couple of years before she got killed. Paul Levy, who is executor of her last will, wanted to publish her complete works, but the introduction was published as a separate work. No doubt he thought it was not a finished book. This is what he wrote in the preface to the German edition of 1925. These pages of Rosa Luxemburg are the product of the lecture she gave at the Social Democratic Party School. They are manuscripts. The style often betrays the fact that it is a written speech, that is a lecture. Neither is the book complete. In particular, it lacks the theoretical parts on value, surplus value, profit, etc. In effect, what is set out in Karl Marx's Capital on the function of the capitalist system. One of the premises, of course, is that you've already read Capital in one sense. The state of the posthumous manuscript does not make it possible to grasp the reasons for these gaps. Was it the abrupt end of her life that prevented Luxemburg from completing what she had undertaken? Was it because the bandits, guardians of order, who had broken into her house, stole, among other things, the missing parts of the manuscript? In any case, the posthumous manuscript offers certain clues that the text as it stands today cannot be considered complete. Needless to say, we've seen that in terms of Marx at all. However, Paul Froelich, one of Luxemburg's main disciples, is more precise than Paul Levy. In his biography of Luxemburg, he writes, from a letter written by Rosa Luxemburg on 28 July 1916 from the women's military prison, the Barnimstrasse in Berlin, to the party publisher IHW Dietz, we know the general plan of the whole work, which was to have included the following chapters. This is the same thing that we try to do when we mine the what were originally the 6 volumes of Capital. What is economics, social labor, economic political perspectives, primitive communist society, economic historical perspectives, feudal economic system, economic historical perspectives, the medieval town and the craft guild, and then commodity production, wage labor, the profit of capital, and the crisis. Now, needless to say, you can see that this kind of resembles what Monroe was doing with his land economics. So you can see this at work, that you need to sort of explain historically, the the rise of the feudal system, the movement from slavery, from primitive communism or primitive accumulation in all of its different forms, to ultimately the foundations of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and the creation of the commodity under capitalism, and then, of course, the issues of labor's relationship to all of these kind of elements. It's all very systematic. So you can see in this particular link here the introduction of the text itself, the translation of it. It's not that many pages, but You can read it in English at this link, which is also on Medium. Doesn't give you a lot, but as I've said, and as was said above, it is a written speech in the sense that it's a kind of lecture, and it's not fully a class or course, and it's not an academic work in the fullest sense. So it has all of these other little elements going on in it. So I put in a little history of from Wikipedia, what the foundation of the Social Democratic Party was. It lasted a very long time. Willy Brandt, the mayor of Berlin, who became the Chancellor of Germany, was a member of the Social Democratic Party. Now, when Germany was divided into East and West, the SPD it was located mainly in the eastern side of the Soviet side of Germany, the East Germany, Democratic whatever German Republic. And needless to say, the party was outlawed in Nazi Germany, returned to government in 1969 with Willy Brandt. Meanwhile, the East German branch of the SPD was merged with the ruling Socialist Unity Party of Germany. In the modern Federal Republic of Germany, the SPD's main rival is the CDU. And as of 2024, the SPD is in the ruling government in coalition with the FDP and the Greens, with Olaf Scholz from the SPD as chancellor. So, needless to say, it's possible to be, part of this thing that was the Social Democratic Party, which was up till 1959 anyway, identified with a Marxist kind of thing, which probably bent a lot of, in the Western context, bent some people at Pentagon out of shape. As a reaction to government prosecution, the Erfurt program of 1891 was more radical than the Gotha program. This is stuff that, you got to fill in a lot of German history here, demanding nationalization of Germany's major industries. Nationalization of industry is actually pretty important, and in fact had an imperial kind of perspective in one sense. In 1891, the party officially became a Marxist party to the gratification of the aging Engels. However, the party began to move away from revolutionary socialism, which is really the problem that that Luxemburg represents at the turn of the century. Edward Bernstein, you've seen his name before. Bernstein is a person many Marxists have issues on, because Bernstein talks about, how are we going to deal with socialism? What is social democracy supposed to do? And if you could just win reforms under capitalism, you could get to socialism. There's this kind of incremental evolutionary path to socialism. And, there's still always people who think that, it could sort of happen. The government builds roads, but doesn't build roads in a good way or a bad way or whatever. And it's kind of fragmented in that sense in the American context. Radical Party activist Rosa Luxemburg accused Bernstein of revisionism and argued against his ideas in her pamphlet Social Reform or Revolution. And Bernstein's program was not adopted by the party. Anyway, you can look at your own history of the Social Democratic Party in Germany and its relation to other social democratic parties. They're not all the same, needless to say. Now, I included at the end here a little comment, because I had introduced this in some other works, a little piece on the relationship between finance, the economy, and industrial capitalism. So an article in Jacobin about financialization is not wholly autonomous, and at your leisure, you might read it at Jacobin, because I think it refers to essentially the same underlying problem that we'll look at, and that is the industrial capital, merchant capital, financial capital are all things that Marx will get us to sort of deal with as we move through capital. So to end, I'll show this little video, and I hope it'll work.  'Let's see if we can do it directly.
Bourgeois society stands at the crossroads. Either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism. Those words echo down the ages as a prophecy and as a challenge. They were written over 100 years ago by a middle-aged woman in a freezing German jail cell. A woman who would go on to leave an indelible mark on history. Rosa Luxemburg was a radical, a rabble-rouser, and a revolutionary. She was one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, and her calls for freedom, socialism, and democracy scandalized people at the time, both from the left and the right. So who was this woman whose passion for revolution and justice sent shockwaves throughout German society, whose thought continues to influence millions around the world today? I'm here in Berlin 100 years after her death to find out. All accounts of her, both praising and damning, agree on one thing: the fact that she lived a truly extraordinary life, especially for a woman of her time. She was Polish, she was Jewish, she was an immigrant, she was a political refugee, she was disabled, she was a socialist. There were so many strikes against her name that should have kept her on the margins, that should have shut her up. But she never shied away from speaking her mind, especially to people who were considered her social superiors. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is the home to archives charting her life, work, and legacy. She was born in 1871 into a lower-middle-class family in Poland, then part of the vast Russian Empire. This was a time of pogroms, violent union busting, and socialists being hung in the street. As a teenager, her left-wing loyalties caught the attention of the police, and she was forced to flee the country. She earned a doctorate in economics and eventually found her way to Germany. There she joined the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which at the time was a mass movement. She quickly cemented a reputation as an impressive public speaker, a tireless organiser, an activist, an educator, and a pioneering thinker.
Rosa Luxemburg was an extremely prolific figure. She was also an extremely charismatic leader of the socialist movement, and her contribution goes in many directions. So I would say there's three areas in which Luxemburg's work is important: in economic study of capitalism in connection to imperialism, the political study of socialism, and the relationship to the national question.
What makes Rosa Luxemburg such an original contributor to economics and to Marxist thought?
She says that the way in which capitalism enters into contradictions and the reasons, the conditions for the accumulation of capital have to do with the fact that capital expands to extra-European markets. So faced with the crisis of overproduction and underconsumption within their domestic advanced capitalist markets, capitalists seek for investment opportunities abroad. And they do this by finding markets that have not been conquered by capital yet. And this connects Luxemburg's economic analysis to one of her main contributions to the study of Marxism, which is the link between the analysis of the crisis of capitalism and imperialism, imperialist wars.
Rosa's economic work charted capitalism's drive to conquer and cannibalize more territory, fueling war and destroying the environment. So for her, socialism was always bound up with the struggle against colonialism. This thinking solidified a firmly internationalist outlook. Whilst many of her peers were throwing themselves into national liberation struggles, Rosa Luxemburg dismissed this as a kind of bourgeois distraction, focused on securing a handful of short-term gains for a handful of relatively privileged workers, while just leaving everyone else in the dust. And moreover, if capitalism is a global system of global destruction, only global solidarity can hope to provide a solution. Luxemburg argued we can't live in a world where capitalism is rendering life literally unlivable, so it's on us to change it. Here in Kreuzberg, I attended the Homage to Rosa Luxemburg conference, where leading scholars gathered with people from all walks of life to celebrate Rosa's legacy.
Ich habe inzwischen fast den Eindruck, Revolutionen finden eher in der Marketingindustrie statt, sind eher das, was uns heute das Kapital erzählt. Revolution in Düften, bei beispielsweise Kosmetik, oder die Revolution in der zwischenmenschlichen Kommunikation bei Digitalem und Internet. Ich glaube, dass Rosa Luxemburg viel mehr bei Transformation als Gedanken war, als Überlegung war, als bei der Vorstellung, es würde einen großen Knall geben und danach wären alle Widersprüche weg und das Proletariat wäre befreit und der Sozialismus kommt über uns alle. Und deswegen glaube ich, dass wir, wenn wir über Revolutionen heute reden, dann doch eher in einem dauerhaften, in einem transformatorischen Sinne, in einem, der immer wieder neue Bewegungen, neue Selbstkorrektur, permanentes Lernen braucht.
Around the turn of the century, as the SPD were beginning to make gains in parliament, some prominent leaders like Edward Bernstein started to distance themselves from the militancy of some of the membership. They pushed for gradual wins and cooperation with capital instead of revolution. Rosa Luxemburg took them to task for this approach, sparking the now famous Bernstein debate. She argued that whilst reforms are important, abandoning revolutionary goals altogether means propping up a system fundamentally geared towards the destruction of life.
The Bernstein debate was very important because with this debate she became famous in the German Social Democratic Party. The Bernstein debate was the starting point of developing step by step later a new type of left politics from below, from the social movements, from self-organization, from a new understanding. You see Lenin, Kautsky and all the other sort, we should bring the right consciousness into the masses. She had a totally different view. The masses, by their own practice, will develop, and we should help them to develop their own consciousness.
She believed that real liberation and real socialism had to be grounded in the kind of self-enlightenment and self-education and class consciousness that came from ordinary working people engaging directly in struggle. Socialism couldn't come from the top. Socialism had to come from the kind of power that remains with the masses. This kind of thinking is grounded in the staunch conviction that socialism and democracy are fundamentally interconnected and fundamentally inseparable. Socialism without democracy is just tyranny by another name, and democracy without socialism is just a kind of sham, hollow liberation for a tiny, privileged minority. Peter Hudis is one of the leading experts on Rosa Luxemburg's life and work. We live in a time where the language of freedom is so often captured by the right, and especially the neoliberal right. So, in contrast to that, what did freedom mean for Rosa Luxemburg and the socialists around her?
Luxemburg was a firm supporter and advocate of democracy, including liberal democracy. She argued that a liberal democratic, what we might call a democratic republic, is the best form in which to carry out the class struggle. Because if workers cannot organize openly, if they cannot form trade unions, if they cannot fight for improvements in their everyday conditions, if they're subjected to dictatorial or authoritarian conditions in which this kind of political mobilization is not possible, it's going to make it much harder to agitate against the system. And in fact, when you look at the history of the 19th and the 20th century, the extent that we have vestiges of democratic rights is as a result of these social struggles. But that didn't mean that Luxemburg thought that democracy within the framework of capitalism could possibly be actualized. But she really was one of the most thoroughgoing supporters of and advocates of democracy within the Marxist tradition. But she understood that you don't turn your back. You try to use the democratic rights to the extent you have them within a bourgeois society, but you use them to surpass the confines of bourgeois society at the same time.
Rosa Luxemburg had absolutely no patience with the feminism of upper-class women, which she saw as an attempt to elevate themselves to the status of rich white men, whilst leaving their fellow women to rot in factories and die in childbirth. Rather, she believed that gender justice and sexual liberation had to be undergirded by economic justice and economic equality. Dana Mills is a lecturer, activist and dancer currently writing a book on Rosa Luxemburg. I caught up with her after one of her performances to talk about Rosa's much debated relationship with the so-called woman question, the nature of women's oppression under capitalism.
Rosa Luxemburg was a woman living in a very unequal time. She never had access to a lot of resources that her male comrades had, and sexism was used against her often in the party, including from her very close male comrades, and she was aware of that. However, she goes against what was then considered bourgeoisie feminism, which is feminism focused only on legal rights. So at that time, we're talking about the struggles to get the right to vote, struggle to get women into education. She understands that legal rights are really important, but they're only a part of the holistic being of a human being. So she never puts that at the forefront of her struggle. At the same time, it's really untrue and insincere, I think, to say that she was not interested in the woman question, and she didn't understand that with regards to herself. She was very much in solidarity with her women comrades. You can see how she's really working hard to elevate her women comrades and to sort of create this kind of sisterhood working together. She writes, as I said, a lot about the patriarchy and how oppression starts really from minute structures within society. And she engages with that in various places in her writing throughout her life. So I think she has a lot of things to teach us about what it means to be a feminist today. So it's feminism away from the kind of Hillary Clinton-esque putting yourself against everyone else. It's very much working in concert with other people. It's very much thinking about holistic struggles as connected to each other. And I think basically the most important lesson is you can never talk about the woman question, the feminist question, disengage from anything else happening in society. It always has to be a holistic struggle.
Rosa remained a committed member of the SPD for much of her life, but the ideological rifts between herself and the leadership steadily deepened. In 1914, the competing imperial forces of Europe were gearing up for the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen, and SPD politicians voted alongside the government, passing war credits and calling off strikes and worker mobilizations to support the war effort. For Rosa, this represented a deep and fundamental betrayal of the movement. She and her comrade Karl Liebknecht spent the war at the forefront of the peace movement, and their anti-war agitation eventually landed them in jail. They finally broke from the SPD and founded the Spartacus League, which later became the German Communist Party. Julia Damphaus is a researcher who runs a series of reading groups with Jacobin magazine. I caught up with her on a characteristically rainy Berlin day.
So Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and others on the left of the SPD had a really strong commitment to anti-militarism. And this came from like what ends up being a very intuitive concept, which is like, well, what causes wars? At that time, and arguably still now, the desire for like expanding capitalist enterprise, so imperialism. Their anti-militarism came from this like critique of the function of capitalism, and also just the simple fact that when you go to war, who fights against each other? It's the children of the working class, who have more in common with each other than with their national bourgeoisie, who are the people kind of precipitating this whole thing.
The peace movement grew in strength as the effects of the war really began to bite. The dead piled up, the violence at the imperial frontiers began to return home, and Germany's economy steadily started to crumble. It was in these conditions that Rosa Luxemburg prophesied that a clear choice lay ahead for humanity, either socialism or barbarism. Popular discontent was mounting. A series of mass strikes for peace began in January 1918 and eventually ended in the collapse of the German front in October of that year. Then, a series of sailor and soldier mutinies beginning in Kiel spilled over into a full-blown uprising on November the 8th. The Kaiser abdicated and Germany was declared a republic. Rosa was released from prison the very next day, and she threw herself into the fight, going to meetings, organising shop stewards, and she also published a daily newspaper called Die Rote Fahne, the Red Flag. This one is proletariat of all lands. It's really hard to underestimate the importance of these kinds of newspapers and publications to the revolutionaries at the time, as this was pretty much the only way in which people had to communicate, to organize themselves when the government was steadily assembling to try and quash the revolution, to try and smother it in the cradle. The SPD stepped in to prop up the collapsing state, forming Europe's first social democratic government. Its leader, Friedrich Ebert, was now Chancellor, and the party worked together with other politicians, with the military and with the police to quell the revolution by force.
The Spartacus group around Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, which had campaigned against the war illegally throughout the war, wanted to continue the revolution, or at least certainly not lose those gains that they had made in November, December at the time of the revolutionary uprising.
And so the Spartakists, together with other revolutionaries, stayed on the streets. They armed themselves, they occupied newspaper offices to pump out pamphlets demanding much more dramatic transformation than the SPD was prepared to offer. In the chaos of the days that followed, government forces rolled in and crushed the nascent insurgency. Rosa and Karl were forced into hiding, and on the evening of January 15th, 1919, they were discovered by right-wing paramilitaries, who separated them, tortured them, and finally killed them.
Here, before the hotel, yeah, shot in the head, yeah, and then they came here with the car, stopped here, and throw her in the Landwehr Canal. The killing of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht was one of the greatest tragedies in the history of Germany, because the splitting of the proletarian movement was so big that they didn't come together again. And later on, in 1933, they didn't have the power to fight together against fascism.
The paramilitary forces who murdered Rosa Luxemburg would later go on to form the vanguard of the Nazi Party. And after her death, the SPD government continued to crack down on its own citizens until the revolution was finally defeated.
Rosa Luxemburg lived and died with the hopes of the German Revolution, and the forces of reaction unleashed against her would eventually form the basis of the violent militarized state known to history as the Third Reich. Paul Levy later wrote that it was here that German fascism began its unearthly train of the dead that dragged on for years and years.
But her ideas couldn't be so readily crushed. Her work continues to influence struggles all across the world, and each year, flowers on her grave to remember her extraordinary life, and her message that humanity has an inherent yearning for freedom, one which can't be put down with rifles. These were her final words, written just hours before the soldiers came knocking on her door. Order prevails in Berlin. You foolish lackeys, your order is built on sand. Tomorrow the revolution will rise up again, clashing its weapons, and to your horror it will proclaim, I was, I am, I shall be.
I know you're all ready to run out there and, smash the state. But that's the end of my little prepared remarks. I hope that you'll do some of this reading. I may do another thing on this tomorrow, and we can pursue this slightly further. Begin reading the introduction, the Hudis and Anderson pages 7 to 32. I will upload a PDF of that into the chat as we approach in 5 minutes not 5 minutes, an hour and 5 minutes, the writing workshop. So before 7 o'clock, I'll upload a little excerpt. So we might begin reading that together. Okie dokie. Are there any questions, issues? Brickbats, interventions. If not, we can just go to our regular conversation. I know that some of you perhaps have seen that little Rosenberg video before, but I put it in the today's little deal there, so you can take advantage of it. Anyone?
Well, the SPD was attacking its own people who wanted revolutionary change.
Well, it's no different than the Bernie Sanders people against the Clintonistas, I would assert. I kid you not. You know, the way the Clintonistas purged the Sanders people at the 2016 convention, you know, sort of wrote their own created their own funeral.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I just think that, and I got trashed for saying early in 2016, you know, well, why can't we have a unity ticket, make Bernie the Veep, you know? I mean, get over it. But, you know, there was too much, it was already too much division among the sects. Go ahead.
I was going to say that Wolf's grandfather heard Luxemburg speak.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah. That's how old this was. It was a long time ago.
I would bring up Harriet Fraud as you know, a real example in the kind of Luxemburgian mode to be able to critique bourgeois feminism. I mean, her usual line about Gloria Steinem and the CIA is actually quite appropriate in terms of bourgeois feminism.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna come to an end. Let's move to Joe. You can thank you for listening to Dis and Dat. We'll get back to our regular discussion. 7 o'clock is the writing workshop, and after that will be I think sports will occur tonight, which and there's plenty of interesting sports going on.